So, without further ado, Professor Ken Walker, Professor of Simulation, who's going to maybe give us some of the solutions.
Professor of Surgical Training, I should add, because simulation is only one tool. Thanks very much. I just got this message just before the start, so one or two of the slides may not show, but that's okay. The last time I was in a meeting like this, it was in the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, and I was sitting in the middle of the third row about where Brian is, and I fainted. It was very embarrassing, never happened before, and I woke up kind of being passed along the row. The meeting had stopped, and being passed along the row, and as if by magic, as often happens in a crisis, Dave Sedgwick appeared. And I was really dazed at this point, and I looked up and the light was behind him, and I could have sworn he had a cape on. And although by the time we got through to another room, I checked this and it wasn't the case, but I just would like to publicly thank you, David. And we hope that it won't happen today. It's very appropriate to have this topic discussed in the Belford, of course, where the trainees have spoken so highly of the training that they get here, and in particular in terms of supervision and feedback, and that's consultant driven, and that's been the case over the years. I'd like to say, I think in the titles of the section I'm being asked about this term creative solutions. Are there creative solutions to the problems of service and training, and could simulation be one of them? And I don't have any disclosures, but I do have some beliefs to declare at the start rather than coming to conclusions at the end. Let me tell you my beliefs at the start and then illustrate and justify them. And one is that I don't believe that service can be divorced from training. Although I do think there are some advantages if your service is not so critically built on the trainees that they cannot be rostered to what they need. And I don't believe it can be divorced from training because I don't actually believe that any other paradigm can substitute for clinical experience with all, clinical practice with imperatives of care upon you. However, the apprenticeship model that we've spoken about, if you're a surgeon, it's Halstedian, if you're a physician, it's Oslerian. That kind of model, I do believe, has its limitations, perhaps especially so in an era of controlled hours, which is not a wrong thing. But even when there were plenty of hours, it could not be relied upon to cover all the bases, especially with the complexity of healthcare today. And I certainly had holes in my training when I became a consultant, despite having had quite a long apprenticeship type training, relatively long, in 3 different countries. And I think Karen's talk illustrates the difficulty, the complexity of the product that is medical, or in my case, surgical training, and how difficult that is to assess. But I am here to say that I think simulation can accelerate training in some ways. ACME, it can accelerate, can catalyze the training. It can maintain or develop motor skills by frequent practice, and it can prepare you for infrequent events. The last two, you commonly think of aviation type simulation. The first two, acceleration and catalyzing your training, I'd like to illustrate in this talk. And the evidence around this has grown exponentially over the last couple of decades. Well, been growing since the 50s, and we could spend the whole talk going into it, but I'll just, here are 2 representative recent reviews. One is about technical skills training, transferring from VR to OR in the case of surgery, and another is about non-technical training, non-technical skills. I'd like to take 2, if you'll indulge me, I'll take 2 examples from things that we're doing in the Scottish Surgical Boot Camp, which is kind of, for us, works like an incubator of simulation ideas. And then later in the talk about the Scottish Surgical Simulation Collaborative, which is a much bigger thing across Scotland, which I'll come on to. Now, Scottish Surgical Boot Camp is a course, a 4-day course hosted in Inverness in the Skills Centre, and in the last 2 years it's been adopted by the 2 Scottish Core Surgical Training Programmes as their introductory course, so we get these batches of keen New Start surgical trainees sent to us, and so far we're putting 32 a year through this. And the original aims were to equip core surgical trainees with essential skills for a flying start. That was our original thought as a faculty, and we thought especially we would concentrate on things that we felt we'd learned the long way, or perhaps things that we hadn't learned at all in our training but were key skills. And so if you look at the programme, it won't surprise you to see that there's a mixture of technical skills. Do I have a pointer? No. Technical skills, wet labs, operative skills, laparoscopy, simulators, but also non-technical skills, phone call skills, ward rounding skills, and a little bit of memorable cases, those anecdotal things that apprenticeship is so good for giving you if you have enough exposure. The first example is the wet lab, and it's quite a simple model. In this boot camp there are two tasks, bowel anastomosis and pig tissue and some skin flaps, and of course you can see there that it's all about very demonstration, close supervision and repetition. And of course the idea is that they get the feel of the benefit of repetition and then go into the workplace with less of their attention focused on the primary activity, which is the motor activities become to some extent automated, and much more spare capacity to learn arguably the more important aspects of the operation, what's going on in your head, other things apart from the physical task. And of course that will impress the trainer, and they'll then get more to do. So that's an idea, that's an illustration of accelerating. Same in laparoscopy. In this session, the purpose of the session is just to get them started with a kit, and then they take this kit home with them and pre-practice their motor skills, so that when they hit the operating theatre, motor skills aren't an issue. They're much more open to learn other skills, and the trainer, as you can see, looks very relaxed. Just an aside here, we do know, by the way, that just giving people kit to take home is not enough. They don't use it, and in fact I've got kit like that at home that I don't use. I don't do the frequent practice because I don't have targets to achieve, incentives. Other things take priority. Laura Nichol is a former Belford trainee who has done a large project with these 30 EOSIM trainers that you saw on the previous slide, given to first-year core surgical trainees, but this time with incentives, targets to achieve, videos to upload and be scored. You get an e-certificate and then you move on to your clinical practice. That's the idea, and interestingly, the first phase of her study shows that it doesn't quite work yet, and until assessment is required for ARCP, the qualitative part suggests it won't quite work. And another aside, this is these simulators made by a small Scottish company, started by trainees. There's Roland Partridge there, and with some randomer doing the practice. The other example I'd like to show you, if this video will run, is... No. Well, could have shown you a video, but ward rounding. Many of us feel that the ward round has been discussed in this conference, the ward round has lost its focus as a business-like focus of the day, perhaps. And there are lots of patient safety issues around ward rounds and all the complexities thereof. You can see, if we ran the video, you could see that we have the ability to recreate a ward round with an actor as a patient, and they can have NG tubes, the monitors, the works. They can have the all the charts and things to manage the scenario. But more importantly, this trainee, standing with his back to you, can have a foundation doctor and a nurse who are also actors and are directed in the way that they respond to how the trainee handles the situations. They are directed through their earpieces, and so skills like leadership and communication can be responded to. And these are, of course, skills that you might be familiar with from the non-technical skills for surgeons. Taxonomy, developed in Aberdeen and Edinburgh. There's now an adapted version for ward rounds, thanks to a Health Foundation grant, and this is work that's been happening in the last 2 years in Edinburgh, and which we've used in boot camp. And so we, prior to the ward round, have some discussion about leadership skills, for example, forming the team, having role clarity, like in Formula One. Pit crews, situation awareness, things that dull your situation awareness, being hungry, angry, late and tired, being distracted, that sort of thing. decision making. We talk about types of decision making and the need to change gear, sometimes to slow down when you should. Great work from Toronto on that. Great illustrations from aviation and from surgical reconstruction videos that we have. Communication and teamwork. We're teaching clarity of communication, not hinting and hoping, but having great clarity, particularly at error-prone moments. Closed loop communication, like I'm asking for a CT scan, I'm telling you why, what to go in the form, just say that back to me, that sort of thing. And then we give them the situation that you have a ward round to lead on 3 patients. And we know you don't know the patients, you have a staff nurse and a foundation doctor with you, please lead the ward round. And it's directed from the control room here. Of course, the distractions are sent in partly as part of the challenge, but also it adds to the realism that he's being bleeped away. There's a patient with a loud radio. And actually the noise, it's not like going into an OSCE at all, it's like going into a real ward, and this makes it all much more believable. And we've got over that uncanny valley effect of, and only 1 in 40 candidates has had any problem with the immersion into this. And of course the feedback is the most important part, and we spend longer on feedback than on the simulation, and it's individualized feedback. And I don't have time to go through all these, but we comply with evidence-based requirements for effective simulation-based learning. And speaking of evidence, I'd like to mention Ian Thomas, who's another former Belford trainee, who took this to another level. After going through it as a trainee, he then adapted the ward round for undergraduates, and specifically training on managing the distractions. Final year medical students were put through the ward round twice, and one group between the 2 runs had feedback that was very much targeted on how to manage the distractions, and the other group had fairly wishy-washy feedback. And the difference, unfortunately, I've just had this message. This computer has just told me that it can't show you this graph, but the control group performed better in the repeat ward round, but the reduction in critical errors was over twice as pronounced in the intervention group because of that feedback. And this is just another slide to say that Jen Cleland, who's a professor of medical education research in Aberdeen, has done a qualitative study of the boot camp, and this turns out fits with educational theory, particularly activity theory, and we could discuss that more afterwards if you want. Although I had to say to Jen, do you seriously expecting me to present with this title to audiences of surgeons? But it's there, the theory's there. Okay, I guess I've got 5 minutes. I'd like to talk about the Scottish Surgical Simulation Collaborative because this bicollegiate, Glasgow and Edinburgh colleges, surgical colleges, bicollegiate group was asked by the Scottish Surgical STB, so NES, that's our closest thing to a school of surgery, to provide strategies for integrating more simulation into our training programs, because here's a well-known formula from Issenberg in Miami, Barry Issenberg, about what the simplest formula we have for success in this modality. You need some resources, you need educators, but you need to have it curricular institutionalization, as Barry calls it. And we felt that Scotland is actually relatively rich in facility. In fact, there are some white elephants around the place. There are pockets of great expertise, although there's a way to go on developing faculty in all the nuances of simulation-based training, but there's very little strategy and integration within training programs. And we could talk about where the GMC and JCST are with this at the moment if you want over questions. But our starting principles were that we would undertake to do that. We would work with willing programs, starting with core surgery and with the faculty development side. We would form a collaborative that would play to one another's strengths rather than compete for business. And it took a while to establish that. We would have a pyramid principle that I'll show you in a minute. We would include validation, and we remember that simulation is just one tool, one modality, just as laparoscopic surgery is only one modality and to be picked out of your quiver amongst your other tools. Just as as we've been hearing, the rurality of training in the Belford is just one feature of excellent training, and it's not exclusively defined by that. And so simulation is just one tool of what we're trying to do. Here's the pyramid I was talking about. It's to remind us that courses are only the tip of the iceberg because they're expensive and you don't get the repetition. And therefore the monthly teaching programme is important, but perhaps even more important is frequent practice, both in-house and in hospital. And the strategy for core surgery looks like this: 3 courses. Basics is a cadaveric course in the new Glasgow Cadaveric Operating Centre. The monthly teaching programme is being overhauled at the moment, and the frequent practice thing, well, as our lead example, we're using that laparoscopy project that I told you about. But there is also something here about encouraging weekly or monthly wet labs in each hospital and that sort of thing. And the work stream's progress so far: core surgery is being implemented now. The faculty development, the course for faculty, is coming along next year. And we're moving on to develop strategies now for paediatric surgery and urology. Paediatric surgery have a beautiful course with neonatal animal tissue models, and urology are making a strategy, vascular as well. And of course, we'll get onto specialty programs. It's a little bit more high-tech in terms of using cadaveric facilities like this one in Dundee, and even robotic simulators. And there's a draft strategy complete for non-technical skills training that might apply to multiple specialties. That uses, of course, NOTS workshops that you might be familiar with already, or STEPS team training, but it also uses a new course in the Cuschieri Centre, using the simulated model to train surgeons in the management of recognition and management of crisis, intraoperative crisis. And the last thing I'd like to mention about this collaboratives work streams is a kind of campaign we're on, because we're at the stage where we have recommendations from this large group we have of multiple stakeholders from around Scotland. And at this meeting in February, to which I hope many of you will come, we're going to, in the morning, present some of the evidence, what's going on around the world, some of our strategies. We're going to be bold enough to present a cost-benefit analysis that some Scottish Government health economists are working on for us at the moment, which will be bold enough not just to estimate costs and some simple benefits in terms of, for example, saved theatre time, but estimate some benefits in terms of reduction of harm. We have some actuarial data to include. And then in the afternoon, rather than this just being a talking shop, because the invitees will be from Scottish Government, NES, Directors of Medical Education, providers of medical education as well as receivers, we're going to sit round tables in the afternoon and try to get some unity around a strategy which may or may not look exactly like our proposals. And we hope that you would come to that. I'm going to skip this slide, which is about where this lies in the 200 years of development of surgery, because I'm a surgeon, except to say that we're now in the era of trying to mass produce surgery safely. The average American has 9 operations a year. That's not dissimilar in the UK. We know that the scale of harm, I'm not here to give a patient safety talk, but you might be familiar with some of the data. 10 to 15% of inpatients in hospital have some kind of unintended adverse event. 50% of those are surgical. So if the next generation of trainees, well, I think that they shouldn't have to learn the hard way. I think they shouldn't have to learn any secrets of medicine the long way. And in fact, that there shouldn't be any secrets of medicine. And they shouldn't have to learn anything at the expense of sacrificing any patients on the altar of experience. Or that at least we can minimize the need for minimize adverse outcomes. So if I miss a second fracture in A&E because I made a search satisficing error and only picked up the first one, or if I, because I'm hungry, angry, late or tired, fail on a ward round to appreciate the possibility or the early signs of sepsis in a post-op patient on steroids and send them home and they develop overwhelming sepsis at home, or if I make a poor decision intraoperatively to stick to plan and I do an anastomosis where it's unwise and the patient has an anastomotic leak and dies, then I'll put those things into simulations very deliberately rather than waiting for them to come along. And I'll put them in a safe place for trainees to make mistakes. And one of our collaborators in Boston is called Doug Smink, and he was asked by surgical faculty recently if in their sim centre, are we really at the place now where you're saying to me that even if the trainee's scheduled that day for an operating list, it would be better for them to come away to your sim session? And he said, yeah, I think we're there now, because I can guarantee they're going to see the pitfalls. They're going to go through them in a controlled environment, and they're going to have enough time for feedback. And we are going to be there purely to ensure that happens, undistracted by our service needs. Thanks.